Welcome to another edition of the Giants Huddle podcast brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Football Giants. I am John Schmeelk. Earlier in the week, we had Brandon's cohort over at Bleacher Report, Derek Klassen, doing the skill positions on offense. Now we have Brandon, author of the Trench Warfare newsletter, as you can see from his background, also one of the scouts over at Bleacher Report, who is our offensive line guru. Brandon, thanks again for joining us like you do every year. I hope you are well. Tell the folks where they can find all your stuff.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You can find me trenchwarfare.substack.com. You could subscribe there to all I do with my newsletter. Have my guys coming out here soon in the offensive line class and a bunch of other stuff kind of in the works as well. So that's really the main spot, and then all social media channels, Brandon Thorn NFL.
Yeah, make sure you guys go check it out. If you want offensive line information, this is the guy to go to. He studies at the NFL level, the college level, you name it. He's our go-to source for offensive line breakdowns, and that's what we're going to do with him today. Brandon, let's start, though, with the overall classification of the class. We know there's going to be a ton of first-round guys, but based on the most recent Bleacher Report rankings that are up there, we're recording this on Friday, 13 of the first 39 players on that Bleacher Report big board are offensive linemen. A third. That is a ridiculous amount. So clearly you agree with the general consensus here that this is a pretty damn good top of the draft first round offensive line group.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really good class, and I think I have maybe six or so like true first round grades, and then several, maybe another five, six like early second round grades. Just for additional context there, I don't have 13 first round grades. But yeah, I mean, I definitely could see the NFL valuing a lot of these guys, very highly, even higher than me in some of these cases. So I think all around, no matter who you kind of talk to, it's a really good offensive line class, and I think that's valid. And I think all the positions as well, especially if you're projecting some of these tackles inside, and then the guard class is really good as well. So it's like there's immediate starters at kind of all the positions, and then there's really good depth at pretty much all the interior spots. There's never really any depth at tackle, and I don't know that there is in this class either. Maybe one or two guys you can get like in round three maybe, but after that, yeah, it's tackle drops off as usual.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about a couple of those guys that you think might be able to bounce in. In the rankings I'm looking at, you have both Talaese Fuanga and Troy Fautanu listed as interior offensive linemen, not
Mhm.
tackles. Is that just you think that's where they would play best, or do you think because of their inability to stay outside, they'll have to be moved inside the guard?
More so the former, just I think they'll be best there. And then a little bit of the latter with Fuaga. I posted a thing on Twitter a few weeks ago, 10 clips of him losing the same way, outside hand, not having quite enough range, or his set points being a little short and just getting beat around the corner, primarily with the cross chop. It happened probably a dozen times last year. Maybe a little bit more. I put 10 of them up there. But yeah, that's kind of a typical thing that college tackles, if they struggle in that area, and then, have the prerequisite size, play strength, and run blocking skills. Typically, those guys are good candidates to move inside, which I think Fuaga is a great candidate to move inside. He could play tackle, I think, in the right system, RPO, play action heavy, limited true drop back situations, that sort of thing, San Francisco, places like that. Yeah, he could play right tackle, but I think in the most schemes, the most systems, he would probably be best long term at guard. Uh, you know, I compared him to like a really like a supercharged Vitae, coming out of
Mm.
TCU. He's just way more athletic than he was, but he's kind of similarly built and wins in similar ways as a run blocker, or high end comp Mike Upati. I see a guy like that. And then Fatanu, he's been my top guard since November, December. So yeah, he was just one of those. He's one of those six I mentioned that are like true first round grades for me. I think he's in my top four. I think he's one of the four best offensive linemen in this class, no matter where you want to project him. So I'm just a little bit higher on him, than Fuaga.
Brandon, I got to be honest with you. I thought I was going crazy because I've said the same thing about Fuaga for a couple of months now. What got turned me onto it? Me and you actually hung out for a little bit at the Senior Bowl, and I saw in three straight plays Adisa Isaac during the team portion. This was one-on-one ones. It was a team portion.
Right.
Three straight times he beat him with a quick speed rush outside, and it made me think, all right, well, you get him once, that's fine, but three straight times. So I went back and I watched, and I thought maybe I was being a little bit biased because I've seen Evan Neal struggle getting width and depth on his kick. And I'm like, well, maybe I'm seeing something that's not there. But I really do think that against really pure speed guys at the NFL, he's going to have trouble getting out there and matching their speed if they really rush wide out of that 9 technique.
Yeah, particularly with, not a lot of help either, which credit to the NFL and a lot of these systems, they're providing a lot of help to tackles. So, with that said, I think, you can make a pretty strong case that he should stay outside. I just think it's kind of a no-brainer in terms of getting the most out of him, getting the best version of him long term would probably be a guard. So that's where I kind of lean projecting him. But with the note that, yeah, he could possibly play tackle too. But yeah, some of those situations, real high leverage situations where you're facing a really good pass rusher, and you aren't provided a lot of help for whatever reason, maybe the other side needs it or whatever, or it's just such an obvious pass situation that it's tough. Those nuanced situations, yeah, I think you probably would struggle. And then some of the less nuanced ones too. I mean, it's on the Senior Bowl tape, like you mentioned, and then it's on his film too in college. So it's really not like a big secret. I don't know that it's been talked about quite enough, but yeah, it's there, I think. But he might be the best run blocker in the class. So, he's a really good player. Yeah, so that's kind of how I feel about him.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to kill the player. I think he's a good player too. I think you're right. I just don't think enough people have mentioned that. When, on the other hand, people have gone out of their way to kill Olu Fashanu for a couple of bad snaps against Ohio State against a guy that's going to be a first round pass rusher. One of which he gets beat because he thinks a twist is coming and it's not. And I was thrilled to see you still have Fashanu as your number 2 tackle, and not just your number 2 tackle, but grades touching with Joe Alt. Do you still view those two guys as two players that would be first round, or not even first round, top 10 offensive tackles in pretty much any draft class?
Yeah, I made a slight alteration for our final big board there just to get a little bit more separation there with Alt and him. But I mean, I do think Fashawn is definitely the second best tackle in the class. And yeah, I mean, the Ohio State tape, kind of summarized that well. A few bad reps. That was the worst game of his career in 2 years. So yeah, that one got a lot of spotlight on it. But if you balance it, with all the other games, and I've watched pretty much every game of him, um, it's kind of easy for me to just look at that for what it is, and you see some of those ways that he lost, particularly with his anchor, in other films, but it's not as pronounced as that one. And another thing is he followed that up the rest of the year with maybe the best football of his whole career, to kind of close out his time at Penn State, which was nice to see. Specifically as a run blocker, I thought he really turned the page after that game in a lot of ways in terms of sustaining and finishing blocks, which was my biggest question with him, which is still a little bit of a question, but he did at least show a level of sustain and finish that I hadn't really seen prior to that, at least consistently. So that was another part of it. But the thing about Fashanu that, I think, is really hard to get out of my mind is, when you first watch him last year as a 19-year-old, just how natural he is in pass protection, in terms of movements, set points, hand usage, timing it, syncing it, and it's just pretty special stuff. And I think that that's kind of carried through the rest of his career, for the most part. Again, not perfect, but every player, you could kind of point to some errors here and there. So I just think just how natural it is for him, and then having the traits that he does, chances are he's going to be a good pass protector and a solid run blocker, and that's kind of how I see him. And if you see that, as a tackle, yeah, I mean, top 10, top 15 kind of grade for me.
As someone that evaluates these guys, and then I'll kind of zero in on some of the more giant needs. This is the question I've been trying to figure out in my own head. Fashanu looks so good as a pass protector, so fluid, feet are great. Yet in the run game, and again, I got to go back in my notes and check if it got better at the end of the year. But I did feel like he was on the ground a lot, like he would fall, and I wasn't sure if he was
Mhm.
overextending too much. How do you reconcile such gracefulness and as a pass protector? But then in the run game, I felt like he was on the ground a little bit too much, falling forwards.
Yeah, definitely, and that was the biggest concern for me, So I think it's kind of a case by case basis, but I think if you want to kind of find a through line, throughout his film, a lot of it I think is footwork based and aiming points and landmarks on in terms of fitting on the initial first phase of the block and not that part of it not always being clean. And that just kind of puts him in a compromising position from the jump.
Mm.
That happens quite a bit. So he doesn't really align targets very well. And I think that starts from the ground. So he's just kind of an unrefined run blocker in terms of footwork specifically. And then, I think that's really what hurts him, and if you can't get the first phase of the run block right, the second and third phases, chances are they're not going to be there. So I think he just needs work, there. And I think that can develop, especially considering he's relatively inexperienced, very young. Those are sorts of things that could be developed, but I don't know that he's, that powerful of a guy. And his play strength, I would say, is, good, at best. So I don't know that I see like a very good or elite run blocker here, ever. I just don't, but I do think he could be functional to, above average. So I think that's what you're hoping for. And I think if he gets some things cleaned up with his footwork, I think he can get there. I look at him in some kind of a similar mold as, my comparison, from last year is DeBrickashaw Ferguson, and I just stuck with that. I think that's the high end comp for him, maybe like a Ryan Clady, that kind of guy who are more, I don't want to say finesse, but kind of, they're guys who traditionally fit more in sort of a zone type of run scheme that, would really excel in pass protection, and that's their calling card. Those two guys, being like kind of the best examples of that. But that's kind of how I see probably the most likely outcome for him is one of those two kind of guys, maybe somewhere in the middle. And yeah, so we'll see, but I'm pretty bullish on him.
You love turf. You're good at it. So you start a turf biz. Business grows, your savings grow. Become the most celebrated name in turf. Are you ready for all that life brings?
Giants Huddle Podcast is brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. From game day to every day, Citizens is made ready for Giant fans with insights, guidance, and solutions. Learn more at citizensbank.com. We're joined by Brandon Thorn from Trench Warfare. Brandon, want to touch on Joe Alt here, because if the Giants don't go quarterback or receiver at 6, I think the only other guy that really makes sense for them would be Joe Alt. Now, here's the trick. They got Andrew Thomas at left tackle. They ain't moving him. How would you feel if the Giants chose Alt at 6, but then had to move him over to right tackle? Do you think that should be something that should stop them from making that selection? I know he was used in an unbalanced line at Notre Dame. I saw it on tape a lot. Como kind of as that extra tight end on the right side next to their right tackle. How do you view him if he does have to get moved to the right side in his first year in the pros?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much like most of these guys. I mean, if you move them, this is a very young class at the top, and I don't see a problem with moving him. There's nothing on film or that I've heard that would suggest a move, especially if let him know right away and he has the entire spring and summer to do it. Yeah, I would probably have no concern with that at all.
Good, simple answer. All right, so I'm going to assume for a second that those 13 guys that you have in the top 39 for Bleacher Report probably are not going to get to the Giants at 47. Maybe Jordan Morgan, and that's a guy we haven't talked about a ton, Brandon, and I think he's an interesting guy who played tackle at a pretty high level in college, but you do see his length, his lack of arm length, get him in trouble a little bit. You have him projected as a guard. Do you think he's strong enough to step in and play guard right away, or is that something he's going to have to develop a little bit more before he becomes a high level guard at the NFL level?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I guess it depends on what you say by high level. Like all pro, I don't see that. That's high level to me. I mean, a functional guard, I would say is in the cards there. For
Okay.
him, he compares really favorably to me to Matthew Bergeron, and that was my comp for him coming out of Syracuse. So very similar sorts of players, I would say. I don't really have any questions about Jordan Morgan's play strength, at all. So I didn't see that. I thought the reason why he lost for the most part in pass protection was technique based and maybe athletic based. But probably more so technique, footwork. He had a really bad habit that was prevalent throughout his film of dealing with, again, wide nine sort of pass rushers that threaten him with speed rather than get to his spot and stay square with good weight distribution. He would oftentimes lean, open up prematurely, and then therefore create a soft inside shoulder and be very vulnerable to losing across his face against inside power moves. And the USC tape, from what I remember, Braylon Trice, tore him apart. And it happened several other games as well, I think, against even lesser opponents. So, everyone points to the Latu game, and it was fine. He faced him 6 or 7 times and, had 2, 3 good reps against him, which was a good tape for him. But I just think when you balance everything else that was on film, to me, he was a pretty easy candidate to move inside. Now, I think there is maybe an outside shot of maybe like a Dion Dawkins sort of guy at left tackle, but I think more than likely you're getting like a Matthew Bergeron kind of pro, who could be a solid guard. And I think he would fit really well in like a wide, tight zone sort of scheme, play action based. I think that would be ideal for him, which, there's a lot of teams that run that sort of scheme. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Giants pick at 47 and 70 here, Brandon. You have a bunch of interior offensive linemen that could fit there. If the Giants want to try to shore up their guard spot, guys like Dominic Pooney, who's a conversion in from tackle.
Mhm.
Go through some of those interior offensive linemen that you like, mid, late second round, early third round that could fit the Giants' need as someone that can either come in and start a guard right away or maybe more importantly, develop over a year or two and eventually become a solid starting guard in the NFL.
I think Cooper Beebe is definitely a good candidate. He's one of the more easier kind of evaluations for me, honestly, because first of all, he has a lot of film. He has, 50 starts or 48 starts. So, I mean, you could, see him execute every sort of block you could possibly want against a variety of competition, especially because Kansas State's scheme is multiple in the run game. So, you're going to see pin pull, duo, inside zone, power. You're going to see everything. So, with that considering, his experience, you really get to see him execute a lot, and he does it at a high level. I mean, it's just consistent. I don't know that there's anything very good to elite. I know I don't think that there is about him, but he does a lot of things well. And he has the size in terms of build and the play strength and the power that I think will translate. And again, not going to be like a high end starter, but I think of all these guys that we're going to talk about, he's the one who's probably most ready to play inside. My favorite maybe of these guys, especially if you can get him, later in the second or even in the third, is a guy like Dominic Pooney or even Christian Haynes, and then Christian Mahogany. Those three guys are really like three of my guys in this class, I would say. Pooney, I just got done watching his film again because I'm making all these cut ups for my guy's article. And I mean, Pooney, at his size, to have the movement skills that he does and the balance, it's really impressive. His ability to stay attached to blocks through counters and shed attempts and just to find his footing. And he's just a really good athlete at his size, and he has a lot of power. So, I mean, and then he repped at center again. Not again, but he repped at center at the Senior Bowl. So you got to see him there and at guard as well. I just think he's going to be a really easy guy to project inside to either of those two spots. And then Christian Haynes, one of my favorite guys in the draft. A lot of guys have been talking about him, and I think for good reason. I mean, he's a technician. I think another guy with a ton of starts, although all of them are at right guard. But yeah, he's I think pretty easy to project. I don't see a super high ceiling with him. I see maybe best case like a Kevin Dotson. He was my comparison for him, kind of a right guard only player, but a guy who has good length, good strength, and I just think mentally he's so sharp. He's so consistent with technique, footwork, timing. He just definitely knows what he's doing out there and is very consistent with it. And I think he's probably the best finisher in the draft as well. He's really, his demeanor is what you're looking for. I think offensive line coaches will particularly love him. And then Mahogany is kind of the wild card of the bunch, I think. But I tend to favor these guys, especially if you can get them a little later. Big, maybe the most powerful guy in the class. I think he's certainly in the conversation. He's just a little wild and kind of frenetic, I would say, in how he plays. And he just needs to learn to kind of reel it in and be more patient, but really good athlete. And he's mean and he's powerful. So I tend to favor those guys. And if he gets into a spot with, a decent offensive line coach, I think he could turn into a starter as well.
I think the other guy you have in that neighborhood is Isaiah Adams out of Illinois, Brandon,
Yeah.
who I really liked at the Senior Bowl. They had to play him at a position at tackle where he just didn't have the movement skills to play there. But at his size at guard, I think he can. I think he's not that dissimilar from Mahogany, where, if he shores some things up, I think he could be a real solid starting guard at the next level.
Yeah, you really got to watch a lot of his film, I think, because if you do watch the right tackle game against Penn State, he kind of got put there at the last minute, I think, to account for injury, and it was a really bad game.
It was bad.
Yeah, it was very bad. But, the more you watch him, he kind of settled into it, I think, right tackle that is. He had 10 starts there, and he kind of got better at it. He got more serviceable, functional, but you really kind of got to go back and forth years with him and make sure you watch him at left guard. And then I think if you do that, then you could kind of get a really good idea of what he is. I compared him to Aaron Banks coming out of Notre Dame. I think they just play very similar. But yeah, I think he's an above average run blocker. He has solid quickness, body control. He's a good finisher. He's upright, and he plays tall like Aaron Banks. Guys can slip, get inside underneath, slip him a little quickly. So, that's going to be kind of an issue for him. But I think pass protection, he's fluid, he's quick. We saw some of that at the Senior Bowl, although his hands, I thought got him into trouble a little bit. But, he's a real interesting player. And I think he has the size, the strength, the quickness, and enough finishing skills to, at least be a backup right away. And a guy who can become a solid starter within his rookie contract, I think, is kind of how I would characterize how I view him.
You're ready for a change. Payday comes early with Citizens, so go to that retreat. New You moves to the country. Now you're raising goats and launching a lifestyle brand. Are you ready for all that life brings?
Giant fans love a winner. It's why they love Citizens. Named the 2022 Best Bank in the U.S. by The Banker as the official bank of the Giants and sponsor of the Huddle. Citizens is made ready for fans of Big Blue. Learn more at citizensbank.com. Kind of these two, second or third tier, however you want to split up the first group, Brandon, that you have there is Patrick Paul and Roger Rosengarten. I like Rosengarten a little bit more. I just think his movement skills are really strong, and I think he's being underrated by some people. And then Patrick Paul is just really tall and long. I think he might just be a little too tall, to be honest with you, in some ways. How do you view those guys as potential day two targets at offensive tackle that maybe have some upside to become starters one day?
Yeah, so Patrick Paul, I mean, I like him a good amount, even though I have, a grade on him that's, more like third round. I just think, he is tall and long, but the best parts about him, I think, are his strength and his competitive toughness. I mean, I'd put him on the short list for best finisher in the draft.
Wow.
He brings it kind of an edge to him. You got to watch the sideline copy when you watch him because there's a lot of extracurricular stuff happening.
I'll have to do that. Yeah,
his...
I'll have to do that then. I usually just watch the end zone with these guys.
Yeah, I mean, you watch the end zone, but then if it cuts off and you don't get to see the finish, which it happens a lot, you got to just watch his finishes because he's going to bring an edge. He reminds me a lot of Braxton Jones in that, because Braxton Jones is the same way. He's very physical, very aggressive, and very strong. And I think Patrick Paul is all those things, but his technique needs a lot of work. in pass protection, specifically strike timing and hand placement. It was an issue in college, lets guys get inside of him way too often, which, allows you to see him get into compromising positions and get out of them fairly well. But in the pros, he's just going to have to clean that up. You can't get into that many positions. So hand placement is really the big thing with him. And if it could just get incrementally better, I think you have a starter. But that has to get corrected first. And yeah, we'll see there. So I just thought that really is holding him back more than anything. And then Rosengarten, to me, I honestly wish he kind of would have went back. I just think he needs to get stronger. He's just not very strong. He gets kind of bullied, with anchoring or trying to anchor in the run game. Just doesn't really generate much movement. He's very scrappy, very crafty, I would say as well. I think he has the right mentality, and I really like some of the stuff he does. He has a 3-step short technique, which is kind of a nuanced pass protection technique that some pros primarily use, but he's been coached by pros since high school, former pros, that is. So he's been exposed to like some really high level coaching, and I think you could see that. But I just think he just needs to develop. He just has to get stronger. So I don't know that he's going to be able to deal with the bull rush, right now, in the NFL. So that's my biggest question. But over time, if that happens, I think he could potentially start. But I see more of, a definite kind of swing at best, until that happens with him.
You mentioned some of the technique stuff with Morgan and with Patrick Paul. Two other tackles that I think physically, Brandon, can rank near anybody at the top of this class is Suamataia from BYU and Guyton from Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. Boy, they move so well. Suamataia, I think, plays with a real good nasty streak. He likes to just bury people in the run game. But boy, in pass protection, their hands, they're just not in the right place ever, especially Guyton. Is that something that you think when you scout these offensive linemen, that is the best chance of being corrected? Getting your hands high, getting them inside, things like that. Is that something that you think with the right coaching you can fix at the next level?
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, I think you really have to look at the player, because oftentimes when the hands are bad, the feet are too, in terms of positioning. So you really kind of have to dissect those. And I think with Guyton in particular, he's just one of the more inexperienced guys in this class. Him and Amarius Mims is obviously the one that everyone talks about, but Guyton he's a 1-year starter. He played defensive line. He hasn't even been playing offensive line for more than a couple years. So this guy's like brand new to the position. He's very raw. You could see it. He's another guy that, I guess if he gets drafted in the first round, this is a moot point, but, probably could have, done well for himself to come back another year. So he's one of those guys that initially it may be very up and down and kind of dicey, as a rookie, but man, to be 6'8", 320 and to move like that is, I mean, you saw it at the Senior Bowl, you see it on tape. You talk to anybody at Oklahoma, which I've gotten to talk, to some people there quite a bit about him for the last couple of years, and or a year and a half or so. And like, it's just so clear that this guy is different physically in terms of with being 6'8" and how easy of a mover he is. I said in my report, he just glides on the field. So those things are great and nice, but the thing that really makes me like him is he's strong as well. His anchor is actually really naturally strong. I think you saw that at the Senior Bowl, although there was some up and down stuff there, especially against Denarius Robinson, but you see it on tape as well. So the fact that he's naturally strong, that good of a mover, that big, that inexperienced, which is kind of a plus and a minus. Yeah, I would definitely roll the dice with him in the second round. He's probably going to go in the first, but I always like to think of it like, I gave him a second round grade, but, if I was scouting for Philly, he'd be a first round grade all day. If I was scouting for even like a Cincinnati where he can maybe sit, I'd feel a lot more comfortable giving a first round grade to a guy like that. So that's kind of how I see him. And then Suamataia is just kind of a little bit of a step down from that. I think, not quite as imposing of a guy as Tyler Guyton, I would say. But a high pedigree player who the flashes with him are nice. I actually saw some good flashes in pass protection using his hands, but it's just very up and down. So he's a guy that, I would be more comfortable drafting like firm second round. I don't know that I would go first, with him. And honestly, with him, considering he was, I think, the number 3 freak on Bruce Feldman's freak list, I was expecting a better athlete. When I watched him on film, I think he's a good athlete, but I was expecting like Tyler Guyton, so that's kind of why I have him at that 6th spot, OT6 for me, but definitely a quality prospect. I mean, I still like him.
Final one, Brandon. I appreciate you giving us 30 minutes here. It's been fantastic. Give me one day 3 guy that you really like. That's one of your guys. And then Giant fans want Evan Neal to kind of rebound and, take the next step and become a good starting offensive tackle. What are the challenges there? What does he really need to clean up in your eyes to turn that corner and become a good starting right tackle in the NFL?
So yeah, day 3 guys, there's a lot of them in this class, especially on the interior. I mean, gosh, I would throw out maybe like a Hunter Norzad, from Penn State. He's only been playing center 1 year. He's a transfer from Cornell. He's just, I think, made up the right way in terms of processing skills, competitive toughness. But then he's a really good mover. He didn't test, but you watch the film, he's a really good mover, and he just sticks on blocks pretty well. I just think he could get better. He could kind of develop into a starter at center. So he's a guy I'd throw out there, but I love the center class. So there's a lot of centers that I can, just ask me a different one, different day of the week, and I would, talk about another one. But he's one of the ones that continually kind of sticks out for me. And then with Evan Neal, I've thought about this a lot, and I think, well, first of all, first and foremost, getting healthy. Last year was, he just wasn't healthy. Most of those 7 starts I think he
And
had.
by the way, he wasn't the first half of his. It's the second half of his rookie year. He was playing on a bad knee too. To be honest with you, he's been healthy for the Giants for like 6 games. It's been crazy.
I know it's really unfortunate because he's a guy who needs every ounce of movement skill that he has. Being 360, and if you hinder that and play injured, it's just tough to get a real good read on who he can be as a pro. Now, in terms of when he is on the field and, technique wise, I think his biggest thing is learning to be patient and letting rushers come to him rather than chasing guys and falling for the stutters and the tempo and the hesitations and things like that.
And that's where his
Being
balance issues come in, right? When he does that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, he needs to learn. Ideally, he would kind of get the DeJuan Jones treatment, although I think they're different players. The way that DeJuan Jones was used last year in Bill Callahan's scheme was he was a heavy vertical set guy. He could mix it up and go get guys, but for the most part, he's setting vertical. And what that does is it forces rushers to come to you, and you obviously need to be a guy who can anchor in that situation because you're going to be closer to the quarterback. But I think Evan Neal can anchor. So, the thing is, if you're vertical setting Evan Neal more often than not, he's not going to have to get out there on angle 45-degree sets as often as he, sometimes does. And any 350 pound plus guy who gets out there too much, I mean, it's not going to look good, especially if, you're really young. So hopefully he can kind of be used that way, or at least if he is setting that way, just to be more patient, with his hands and play big and force guys, just stay inside out, force guys to run through you. And I think that's probably his best bet. In fact, I kind of know that's his best bet. And we'll see if he could do it, if he can have that discipline with his hands to do that. But yeah, I mean, he has to get right physically first. And I don't know how people were writing him off so quick, honestly. I mean, yeah, I liked him coming out. Maybe that's part of it, but he's super young and he's been hurt a lot. Like, you got to give this guy a little bit more time, I think.
No, I'm with you. And just so fans understand, when you say vertical set, you mean kind of straight back, right?
Yeah.
Towards the backfield rather than out towards the sideline, correct?
Yes. And just if people can imagine that in their mind, vertical setting a tackle straight back, you're going to be closer to the quarterback. So there's plus and minus to this. The minus is you're closer to the quarterback, so you're more susceptible to power. But that's why you typically see the 340, 350 pound plus guys vertical setting, because those are the guys that can handle power. So you're kind of Xing out that minus. And the positive is You're not playing in that much space. And you cut what the rusher can do in half, straight off the top. They're not going to be able to beat you necessarily around the corner because you're already so deep in the pocket. So you kind of mitigate the speed aspect of it, and you kind of play more of a power-oriented game. And typically you see the bigger guys do that, and or at least the guys that can anchor, like Joe Thomas is kind of an anomaly. He did it a lot. He's not the biggest guy, but he had a great anchor. And some other guys have had success with it as well. Trent Brown being one, and some other guys. But yeah, I just think that approach would probably give Evan Neal the best chance of being a good pass protector. And, we see the flashes in the run game. I mean, he's a powerful guy and he's strong. So I don't think those are the questions. It's just his discipline and his technique, is the biggest thing, I think.
I apologize for going a couple of minutes long, Brandon. Carmen
Oh, no.
Brasillo is from the Dante Scarnecchia school. Did he use that type of stuff in New England when Scarnecchia was there, more vertical setting with the bigger guys? I know you mentioned Trent Brown, which is why I asked.
Who's that?
When Scarnecchia was in New England, how much did they use vertical sets with their tackles? Because that's who Brasillo learned a lot from when he was an assistant under Scarnecchia.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't know that Scarnecchia necessarily majored in that. I did see Trent Brown doing that there. But as far as other tackles that played for Scarnecchia, typically they were kind of more smaller guys. I know he had Nate Solder, but he was a finesse kind of guy. Like that wouldn't really fit him. So, but Scarnecchia is one of those guys who probably could teach anybody anything, and is going to adjust to whoever he has. So yeah, I mean, which you saw, he had so many different kinds of body types. Shaq Mason, Trent Brown. I mean, 6 foot, 6'8", like, power, finesse guys all over the place, as well. So it's like, yeah, Scarnecchia is kind of his own thing in some sense. But yeah, like Bill Callahan, I would say is a good example of that. He has used that pretty extensively, and I think that's a big reason why DeJuan Jones was able to have as much success as he had last year, was because he was handled in such a great way. And so vertical setting heavy. And then when he faced guys like TJ Watt or Nick Bosa or some of the matchups he had, he was provided a lot of help. And then he was kind of unleashed here and there, but it was in spurts. It was very selective. And he was in the perfect spot, so sometimes it happens like that and guys can get maximized. So hopefully Neal can kind of get into a similar sort of situation.
Brandon, awesome stuff again. Thanks for joining us. Tell the folks one more time again where they can subscribe to the Trench Warfare newsletter and everything else you're up to.
Yeah, so trenchwarfare.substack.com is where you could find me, subscribe to my newsletter, get all my work there, and then social media, Brandon Thorn, NFL.
Thanks for joining us on the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. We'll see you next time, everybody.